There is a certain kind of person who, when faced with the opportunity to sell their classic Porsche, doesn't hesitate. They refuse, not because the offer is too low, not because they haven't thought about it, but because something in them simply won't allow it. You could put a number in front of them that makes no logical sense to reject, and still, they would shake their head. Most people would see a financial decision. They see something else entirely, and that difference is worth examining, because it reveals something deeper than preference or attachment. This isn't really about the car. On the surface, it looks like stubbornness, a refusal to move on, a reluctance to let go of an object that by all rational measures could be replaced or upgraded. But when you look closer, you start to notice a pattern. People who hold on to classic Porsches aren't just holding on to machinery. They're holding on to something far more specific, something tied to identity in a way that most possessions never quite reach. A classic Porsche isn't just owned, it's experienced over time. The way the engine responds, the weight of the steering, the imperfections that only the owner understands. These details accumulate. They form a kind of private language between person and machine. And once that language is learned, it becomes difficult to abandon, not because the car is perfect, but because it is known. Now consider how rare that feeling is in modern life. Most things people interact with are designed to be replaced. Phones, laptops, even relationships sometimes feel temporary, interchangeable. But a classic Porsche resists that pattern. It demands familiarity. It rewards attention. It changes slightly over time, and in doing so, it requires the owner to stay engaged. That ongoing interaction does something subtle to the way a person thinks. People who refuse to sell these cars tend to develop a deeper tolerance for continuity. They are less interested in constant upgrading, less drawn to the idea that newer automatically means better. Instead, they place value on refinement, on understanding something completely rather than replacing it prematurely. This creates a kind of psychological stability that stands in contrast to the rest of their environment. But there's something more beneath that, because the decision to keep a car like this is rarely made in isolation. It's often connected to a specific period in life. The first time they drove it, the circumstances under which they acquired it, the version of themselves that existed at that moment. Over time, the car becomes a reference point, not just for memories, but for identity. A man in his early 40s might still have the same Porsche he bought in his 20s. Back then, it represented ambition, progress, the feeling of finally reaching something he had worked toward. Years later, the context has changed. His life is different. His priorities have shifted. But the car remains, carrying with it a version of him that no longer exists anywhere else. Selling it would feel less like a transaction and more like erasing something. This is where the attachment begins to make sense. Because humans don't just hold on to objects, they hold on to continuity. They look for anchors in a world that changes too quickly. And for some people, that anchor takes the form of a machine that has remained constant while everything else evolved around it. There's also the matter of control. A classic Porsche is not passive. It requires attention, maintenance, understanding. You don't simply drive it and forget about it. You stay involved. And in that involvement, there's a sense of agency that's increasingly rare. When something feels slightly off, you notice. When it needs adjustment, you respond. The relationship is direct, unmediated. In a world where so much feels abstract and distant, that kind of direct interaction becomes valuable. It offers clarity. Cause and effect become visible again. You do something, and the machine responds. You neglect it, and it shows. That feedback loop reinforces a belief that effort matters, that attention produces results. And once that belief is internalized, it extends beyond the car. But there's also a quieter layer, one that isn't immediately visible. Many people who keep these cars have spent years learning them, not through manuals, but through experience. They know the subtle differences in sound, the slight changes in behavior, the small inconsistencies that would go unnoticed by anyone else. That knowledge isn't easily transferable. It doesn't exist in a format that can be handed over. So when the idea of selling comes up, it's not just about losing the car. It's about losing that accumulated understanding, that sense of familiarity that took years to build. Starting over with something new would mean returning to a state of not knowing. And for someone who has invested that much attention, that trade doesn't feel worthwhile. there's also a social dimension that often goes unspoken. Within certain circles, owning and maintaining a classic Porsche carries a kind of quiet respect, not because of the price, but because of what it represents. It signals patience, commitment, a willingness to preserve rather than discard. These are traits that aren't always visible in other areas of life, but here they become clear. And yet, from the outside, it can look irrational. Friends might question the decision. Family might suggest moving on. Financial logic might point in a different direction. But for the person holding onto that car, the equation is different. The value isn't measured in market terms. It's measured in continuity, in familiarity in the accumulation of experience that can't be replicated. This is where it becomes clear that the refusal to sell isn't really a refusal at all. It's a choice, a deliberate decision to maintain a connection that has proven meaningful over time. And that kind of decision says something about how a person approaches the rest of their life. They are less likely to chase constant change, less likely to discard something the moment it loses novelty, more willing to stay with things, to understand them fully before moving on. That approach can be seen in their work, their relationships, their thinking. It reflects a broader orientation toward depth rather than speed. But there's something else worth considering, because holding on to something for a long time also means witnessing its imperfections. The flaws become familiar, the limitations become part of the experience. And instead of rejecting those imperfections, they are integrated, accepted, even appreciated. That process mirrors something deeper about how people relate to their own lives. The ability to stay with something imperfect, to continue investing in it despite its flaws, is not a common trait. It requires patience. It requires a certain kind of perspective, and often it develops through repeated experiences of engagement over time. A classic Porsche becomes a kind of training ground for that mindset. It teaches that value isn't always found in perfection, but in familiarity, in the depth of understanding that comes from sustained attention, in the relationship that forms between a person and something that has been present through multiple phases of their life. And so the question shifts. It's no longer about why someone refuses to sell their car. It becomes something else entirely. What does it mean to hold on to something long enough that it becomes part of who you are? Because at some point the car stops being an object and starts becoming a reference point, a marker of time, a container for experience, and letting it go would require more than just a decision. It would require a kind of separation that not everyone is willing to make. So when you see someone holding onto a classic Porsche long after it would make sense to sell it, it might be worth looking beyond the surface. It might be worth asking what that car represents to them, what it has carried, what it has witnessed, and maybe, more quietly, it raises a different kind of question. Not about cars, but about your own life. What are you holding on to? Not because it makes sense on paper, but because it holds a version of you that you're not quite ready to let go of.